Okay. Hello, everybody from around the world. Greetings from Philadelphia. And thanks for joining us. Today's program, Footnote to History, is the 10th in an ongoing series of free monthly Zoom programs presented by sons and daughters of Holocaust survivors of Greater Philadelphia, one of the earliest groups of its kind, founded in 1979. We have no dues or officers, but we do have a passion for truth and a bond formed by shared experience. We are an active, vibrant, and welcoming organization. And if you are a child of survivors and you live in the Philadelphia area and you're interested in joining, please drop us a note on our group website or our Facebook page, or contact me directly through my website or through Facebook. These free monthly Zoom programs are at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Sundays, and they are recorded and can be found on my YouTube channel within a day or two of the program. Please make a note of our next program a month from now at 7 p.m. March 3rd. Randy Biederman will speak about the 2019 book she co-authored with her late husband, Mark Biederman, titled Schindler's Listed: The Search for My Father's Lost Gold. That's 7 p.m. Sunday, March 3rd. Schindler's Listed: The Search for My Father's Lost Gold. The Zoom link will be the same as the one you are using right now. So please make every effort to join us again. Andy Laszlo and I have never met, or we hadn't met until about 10 minutes ago. And although we're both sons of Holocaust survivors, our experiences are quite different. My mother, who hid for 14 months in the sewers of Lviv, saved by Polish Catholic sewer workers, was the first Holocaust survivor to speak publicly around the United States, with 40 appearances in 30 cities from 1949 to 1953. My father, a survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, attracted international attention when he testified at the Auschwitz war crimes trials in Frankfurt in 1965. Consequently, my sister and I knew why we grew up without grandparents. By contrast, Andy's father, a Hungarian Jew who survived Bergen-Belsen, did not speak of his past for 50 years, but he did write about it. Andrew Laszlo Sr. grew up in Papa, Hungary, the only member of his family to survive the Holocaust. He came to America with a few pennies in his pocket and became a successful cinematographer with more than 50 movies and TV series to his credit. For a half century, he kept his past a secret. On January 17, 1997, the 50th anniversary of his arrival in the United States, a leather-bound book detailing his past arrived at his son's doorstep. Andrew Laszlo Jr. grew up in Roslyn, Long Island, New York, a graduate of Phillips Exeter Academy and Dartmouth College. He is retired from a 42-year career with Morgan Stanley. And now from Billings, Montana, Andy, Laszlo will discuss his late father's extraordinary memoir published last year, Footnote to History, From Hungary to America, the Memoir of a Holocaust Survivor. Andy will be glad to take your questions if you want to put them in the chat. And Andy will also let everyone know how to get this extraordinary book, Footnote to History. I'm now going to make Andy the host and turn the program over to him.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll get started. And here we go. All right, David, give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen. All right, wonderful. So, thank you very much for inviting me. On January 17th, 1997, an unexpected package did arrive at my doorstep. And that was 50 years to the date that my father had arrived in New York Harbor. And it contained a memoir that he'd been writing for 10 years. And when I read it, I found out that my father and his whole family were victims of the Holocaust, and only he survived. If you look at this first picture, you'll notice my father has a big smile on his face. For many Holocaust survivors, anxiety, guilt, and depression followed them throughout their lives. Elie Wiesel, whom you all know or have read, once wrote that he never got a good night's sleep after watching a truckload of babies, live babies, thrown into a fire. My father had the remarkable skill and will that he was able to move on, and he refused to let the actions of others define his life. This is a picture of the house he grew up in Papa, Hungary. He grew up there with his mother and father and older brother Zandor. The house still stands today. This is my grandfather, his father. His name was Laszlo. He fought for the Hungarians against the Russians in World War I. And if you notice, he was a high-ranking officer and received many awards and medals for bravery. He thought that Hungary would stand up for their war heroes, but he was wrong. And that misjudgment cost him and most of his family their lives. The Nazi doctrine was that anybody, war hero or not, that had one drop of Jewish blood going back 4 generations was deemed to be a Jew and targeted for extermination. I never got to meet my grandfather, and that's one thing that the Holocaust took away from me. It would have been my wish that he would have been as proud of me as I was of him. My father was a great athlete. This is him second from left. He was on the Hungarian junior national teams in figure skating and fencing, and was groomed for the Olympic Games, being groomed for the Olympic Games. If you look at the smiles on these kids' faces, they had no idea what was waiting for them around the corner. And it's a good thing that the Nazis weren't able to take away from them fun that they had already had. As he was growing up, and at about this time, there were signs of things to come. The Graf Zeppelin flew over Papa, and my father asked his father about the strange spider-looking symbol on the back tail. His father said it was a swastika and wouldn't elaborate. At the same time, the family got their first radio. One of the early programs featured a young, boisterous, and upcoming German politician. It was my father's first encounter with Adolf Hitler. My father loved to march with his school, and when I asked him which one he was in the picture, his answer was, the one with the most medals is me. This is a picture of Vitez Kovacs Lejos, who was his fencing master, mentor, and second father figure. As things started to change, he was no longer allowed to march with his class. He was removed from the Hungarian Olympic teams, but worst of all, his mentor, Vitez Lejos, told him that he would no longer coach him because he was a Jew. He wrote in his book, as I warned you, lots of my past life's aspects are difficult to talk about, very probably hard for you to understand, and reading it might cause discomfort. Yes, from here on, this account is going to get rough. In March of 1944, the Germans invaded Hungary and things changed quickly. His family was evicted from their beautiful house and moved to a small one-room ghetto apartment, which they shared with another family in the Papa Ghetto. And here's where my father's instinct and preparation started to differentiate from those who didn't survive. There was no playbook on what you do in a Holocaust. One had not happened in any of the Hungarians' lifetime. But he started to do things that no one else thought of. They were allowed one suitcase each in the apartment. So during the night, he made several trips back to their old house, and with the possessions that he couldn't take with him, he hid them in caches around the countryside. Each cache had food, medicine, money, tools, and some clothing. These caches helped him survive later on in the story. And he also was a little bit of a rebel. And in one of his first acts of resistance on his last trip to the house, he took a sledgehammer and broke and smashed all of the family's fine china and glassware. He had decided that if his family couldn't eat off it, the Nazis wouldn't either. In June of 1944, he was taken away to the labor camp. This is a picture of my father wearing the labor camp uniform with the yellow armband identifying him as a Jew. I'll take a quick drink of water. The Nazis took the strong and put them to work in labor camps. The old and the weak were sent away to die. When he left for the labor camp, that was the last time he saw his mother. Shortly thereafter, she was put on a train to Auschwitz, where she was killed. At the labor camp, my father's job was laying railroad tracks for the Germans, and he worked very hard all day. But then in a second act of resistance at night, he took a bucket of sand and poured sand into the gearboxes of all the trains. That act could have cost him his life, but he got away with it. And he knew that the gearboxes would seize and the trains carrying German soldiers and supplies would be stranded on the tracks he was forced to build. One day at the camp, the American bombers started a raid, and there was just a moment or two of chaos. My father had thought and was ready for almost anything. He never went anywhere without his knapsack that had everything he needed to survive. So in the 1 or 2 minute window of chaos, he was able to run to the forest and get away. As he was running, he got hit by shrapnel in his leg, and that shrapnel stayed in his leg for the rest of his life. Those who were prepared, and there were a few, did escape, But those who didn't have knapsacks ready stayed at the camp and worked till they were too weak to work till they were too weak, and then they were also killed. My father was on the lam for about 3 months, during which time he lived off the supplies in his caches. And he did more things to prepare. For example, he sewed extra leather soles onto his boots, and that helped him survive when he was at the concentration camps the next winter. In October of 1944, he was captured and taken to the train station. This is a picture of one of the cars like the one he was put into. They were packed like sardines, so tight that when the train started or stopped, nobody moved. My father wrote that even though there were small barbed wire covered windows on each end, the air was unbearably hot, humid, and devoid of oxygen. My father's survival instinct kicked in again. He boarded the train first and went to stand right by the window, where during the trip he was able to get some fresh air. He took some postcards and folded them and pushed them through the barbed wired window to create a channel that rainwater could trickle in. And he had some bacon sewed into his clothes. Those who weren't as fortunate and went to the stand in the middle of the train didn't fare as well. Many of them died before they even got to the destination. For the full 10-day ride, the doors were never opened, and they died from suffocation, lack of water, and many were overcome by their waste products. Everybody on this call knows how people were treated and died in the concentration camps, but what a lot of people don't realize is that before survivors even got to the camps, the people who survived the train rides had to walk off the train over and around dead and decomposing bodies. Their destination was Bergen-Belsen, which was one of the bigger camps after Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was not a camp where people were necessarily dying by the gas chamber. They died from starvation, from freezing to death, and other causes. We found out that Anne Frank was at the camp at the same time as my father, and she died from being bitten to death by fleas and lice that carried typhus. If you look at this picture of this suffering man, you'll notice human remains in the trench right over his shoulder. One day at the camp, a cart of dead bodies was pushed by, and the person pushing the cart yelled out to my father by a nickname, Bondi, which only 2 or 3 people in the world knew. My father didn't recognize him, and they weren't allowed to stop and talk. But when he looked back and turned around, there standing on the hill, the driver of the cart was staring at him. He was emaciated. My father wrote that he was just skin and bones. And my father never figured out who it was. But he thought it might have been his brother Zondor. Zondor was never accounted for after the war, and my father spent most of his life looking for him around the world. But to the day he died, he was haunted by the image of the starving man staring at him as if asking for help that could have been his brother. This is a picture of my father and Zondor sitting on their grandmother's lap before the war. Their grandmother also died at Auschwitz. So at Auschwitz, many people did starve and die of starvation. And here's a picture of a man being attended to by a British doctor after liberation. Many of the prisoners were too far gone to be saved. That wasn't my father, it could have been. My father was over 6'3", And by the end of his time at Belsen, he was down to 90 pounds. And yet he never lost his humanity. He shared his bi-daily potato with a pregnant woman. He thinks the baby was born alive, but he never found out if it survived. As I've been promoting my book on Facebook, I got a comment from a lady who read the book that said that her mother was born at Belsen, and we never know if that might have been the same person. So the next slide is intense, and if intense slides bother you, you can close your eyes for a minute. I'll tell you when you can reopen them. This is the mass grave at Bergen-Belsen. It's a place where the dead and even some of the weak and alive were thrown instead of being buried. Eisenhower ordered his photographers to take pictures like these. He said without them, no one would believe what happened. When I first started giving these talks, I didn't show this picture, but then the audience said that young people had to see them. I was reminded of a Shakespeare quote, "Show me a hero and I'll write you a tragedy." By the same thinking, I think you have to define a tragedy to understand a hero. I believe that the open pit at Bergen-Belsen is the end game when one ideology controls all branches of government and the free press. My father wasn't in this picture. His brother Zondor probably was. But the important point to make is in the future, it could be you or me or anybody that's deemed undesirable by a totalitarian government. I've removed the picture if you want to look again. So in March of 1945, my father and other prisoners were put on a train, and they had no idea if they were going to be set free in a prisoner exchange or going to be sent to another camp to be killed there. The prevailing thought and opinion was that the Germans knew they were going to lose the war and thought the Allies would go easier on them if they didn't see 60,000 starving people in a camp that was built for 10,000. They played one more trick, though, on the prisoners before they sent them away. They mounted anti-aircraft guns on the roof of the train. And sure enough, during the trip, the Allies bombed the train thinking it was a troop transport. My father and his good friend Frogface were able to kick open the door and run toward the forest. When they were 6 feet apart, Frogface was hit by ordnance and literally blown to bits. My father made it to the forest and survived again. After the bombing was over, they got back on the train. Again, they thought they might have been on their way to freedom. But before they did, my father and some others threw the anti-aircraft guns off the train and painted red crosses on the roofs. Their next stop was not freedom. It turned out to be Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was a propaganda ghetto. The Germans filmed benevolent treatment of their prisoners. They showed festivals and feasts and classrooms and sporting events with the intention to show the world how benign they were to their prisoners. But when the camera stopped, it was just as horrible as any camp, maybe even worse. They even had rows and rows of showers for show that were never hooked up to water. When my father arrived, he was put in the Hanover Barracks. And this is a picture of the building where he was interned. It still stands today. When my father walked inside, he wrote, "The building was teeming with the most wretched-looking humanity," which are interesting words from somebody who had just spent 6 months watching people starve to death. As soon as he got there, he contracted typhus, which was usually fatal to people in his condition. He was still very weak and weighed very little. But miraculously, he gained his strength, and after a couple days of not being able to move, he was able to get up and walk around. The first thing he did was inquire if there were any survivors from Papa, and he was told that a man with the same first and last name of about 50 was in the barracks across the yard. And of course, he was hoping it might be his father. They weren't allowed to go outside, but he found a tunnel under the courtyard, and that night he went over to look. And sure enough, he reunited with his father. At first, they didn't recognize each other because they were both so emaciated. But when they did, his father cried. And it was the only time in his life that my father had seen his father cry. His father was a big, strong man. He was in terrible condition. He had a double hernia from carrying another prisoner from the train station to the Theresienstadt ghetto. And he had been beaten almost daily by the Germans, who gained more pleasure in trying to make him submit and bow his head than they would ever have by killing him. And he never did submit, and he never did bow his head. They visited for 1 or 2 times for the next 2 nights. And the third time my father went to see him, his father was in even worse condition, and he knew the end was near. He had contracted typhus. My father watched while the ambulance came and took him away. And in those circumstances, the ambulances didn't take you to a hospital. They took you out in the country to dump you where you couldn't infect anybody else. And my father never forgot that he let his father be taken away from him. In May of 1945, the Germans surrendered and things got even worse. Now there was nobody to provide any food or any water, and my father joined a gang that made daily trips into the countryside looking for sustenance. On one of the first trips, they surprised a German officer still in uniform, a young man, and they were able to take his gun. And my father's first thought was to shoot him because he had just seen his father die a few days ago. But he couldn't do it, and he wrote in his book that it would have been murder, and he would never have forgiven himself. It might have been a young man going home to see his mother and his family. Elie Wiesel said the same thing with different words. He said, only the guilty are guilty. The children of killers are not killers. They are children. On a subsequent trip in the countryside, his group broke into a house, and in the house, they found a piano. It so happened that in their group was a highly regarded pianist named Fejer Georgi from before the war. They tried to get him to play music and he wouldn't because he was in such bad condition. But when they finally got him to play, the song he played was Smoke, It's in Your Eyes. And my father, who was starving at the time, wrote that the sounds filled the air with beauty and humanity and an indescribable joy of being alive. And it's interesting to me to never forget that music has the power to comfort troubled people in a troubled world. So the story doesn't end there. 10 years later, my father was in New York filming an event in the Rainbow Room above Rockefeller Center in New York, and he heard a piano that sounded familiar. When he went over to the piano, there sat George Fejer, who now had an Americanized name. And let's see here, I'm playing the music twice. Let me back up here. And they recognized each other and embraced, and George Fayer played Smoke It's in Your Eyes again. Fayer became a very famous musician. He was a fixture in the New York nightclub circuit, and even mentioned by Ian Fleming in the James Bond book, Diamonds Are Forever. He published all his music except for one song. Smoke It's in Your Eyes was personal, and he kept it for himself. And as they were leaving, he turned to my father and told him that he didn't know if he would ever play music again, but for the encouragement that one day in Theresienstadt. So I hope you could hear the music. Sometimes in these Zoom calls, it doesn't come on as well. That's a picture of George Fayer. So shortly thereafter, the Red Cross took over in Theresienstadt and things got better. And my father gained his strength back. And by the fall of 1945, he was ready to go home. Here's a picture of Main Street Papa at the time when my father arrived. And if you look at this picture at my cursor, you'll notice the flag. And that flag, when I blew up the picture, is the Russian hammer and sickle. The same people who a year ago were Nazis waving swastikas and killing Jews had now decided that since the Russians had taken over, they were Bolsheviks, and told everybody how hard they had worked to save the Jews, which was, of course, nonsense. The first thing my father did was look for survivors from his family, and there were none. Then he looked for friends, and none of them really wanted anything to do with him. After a short time of supporting himself by taking pictures in a photography business, he decided that he didn't want to spend the rest of his life photographing drunk Russian soldiers, so he decided to escape and come to America. Escaping the Russians wasn't easy. In some ways, they were every bit as brutal as the Germans were. But my father came up with a plan. He told a friend that he was going to leave from behind this building on a certain date at a certain time, and please don't tell the Russians. He knew that the friend would go right to the authorities because they paid a bounty of food and money for that type of information. When my father's time arrived, they were waiting for him, but his plan worked. He had left 3 days earlier, and because they thought they knew when he was leaving, they didn't pay any attention to him when he left. He made his way across Europe, walking, hitchhiking, and on a stolen motorcycle, and he made his way to the displaced persons camp in Ulm, Germany. And this is a picture of my father at the time. He was 20 years old. If you look carefully, the suit he's wearing was sewn from a US Army blanket. He found out that there was a higher quota of immigration for people from Yugoslavia than from Hungary. So on his immigration petition, he listed Yugoslavia as his home. And many years later, when I was flying with him through customs, I happened to notice his passport said Yugoslavia. When I asked him about that, he quickly answered, well, I was from a part of Hungary that turned into Yugoslavia, and that maybe he'd tell me a little more later. In any case, his petition was granted, and he was put on a boat in Bremen to be sent to America. This is a picture of the Ernie Pyle arriving in America on January 17th, 1947. When my father stepped on the boat, he decided that the first part of his life was over. He swore he would never think about it or talk about it again. When he arrived in New York Harbor, he had $2 in his pocket. He didn't speak the English language. He had no college education or profession. But what he did have was a tremendous will to move forward. And somewhere in this picture, my father is waving an American flag and smiling as his mind transitioned from the horrors of his past to the big adventure that lay ahead. His first experience with America was on the boat. The first meal was waffles and eggs with sweet maple syrup. And he wrote that he had never tasted anything better in his life, and he could go back for seconds and thirds and fourths. He found out that there were more phones in the Empire State Building than in all of Hungary. And most importantly, America became the land of his dreams. He never forgot that hundreds of thousands of Americans and other allies risked and gave their life so that he could be free when it wasn't their homeland that was threatened. The first thing he did in America was to learn the English language. And I forgot to mention that he had turned 21 in transit on the boat. But the way he learned the English language is he went to a nearby movie theater, and watched Gunga Din over and over again for 12 hours a day. He said that and wrote that after 30 days, he spoke English without an accent. And then he got another big break. He was drafted into the US Army and assigned to the Signal Corps, where he learned the art of motion picture photography. This is my father right here. I mentioned that survival took preparation, instinct, and will, but it also took a big dose of good fortune. His unit was assigned to photograph the nuclear tests in the Nevada desert. He wasn't allowed to go. As a Hungarian, he was a security risk. And that was very upsetting to him. But then 6 months after the filming, everybody else in this picture had died of leukemia. When they filmed the explosions, they were too close and they all received radiation poisoning. When he was discharged from the Army, he knew he wanted to make his career in movies. And he looked for many months looking for a job. Anybody in the audience today that's over 70 will remember the Phil Silver Show and Sergeant Bilko. He showed up at the studio on a Friday afternoon looking for work. And it just so happened that there was a new piece of camera equipment that no one could run. When they asked him if he could run it, he said, "Well, sure, I'm the best you've ever seen." And they said, "Well, come to work Monday and we'll give you a chance and see how you can do." Of course, he'd never seen it before in his life. But that Friday, he hid in the studio, and over the weekend, he practiced taking the camera apart, putting it together, and filming mice or following mice running across the floor. By Monday, he was the best they'd ever seen, and that was the beginning of his movie career. He got another big break on the set of Naked City. Here he is holding a gun while he's photographing a young Dustin Hoffman. The director of photography was an alcoholic, and when he didn't show up for work, my father, who was the camera operator, filled in and learned to be a cinematographer. He was Ed Sullivan's cameraman, and he was hired by Ed Sullivan to film a political event in the Dominican Republic. When they got on the plane, Ed Sullivan said it was a top secret. They were actually going to Havana, where they were granted the first interview with Fidel Castro. Everyone was excited except for my father, who panicked because none of the equipment he had brought with him would work in Havana. The interview that Ed Sullivan filmed with Fidel was filmed by my father, who, without any electricity, put his finger into the socket of the reel and turned the camera by hand. And the 10-minute interview was good enough that nobody noticed when it was shown on national TV. After it was shown, and you can see the interview on YouTube if you like, Ed Sullivan thanked my father for his heroic actions in the war zone. Halfway through filming The Owl and the Pussycat, Barbra Streisand's director of photography of all her pictures, Harry Stradling, suddenly died. And Barbara hired and fired 5 cinematographers before she hired my father, who was able to complete the film. Harry Stradling had told her to never let anybody film her from the left side because he said she didn't look good. But my father convinced her that she had beautiful eyes and skin, and very reluctantly, she allowed him to do a test. She liked the test so much that she wanted to reshoot the whole movie, which of course they couldn't. But if any of you watch any of her later movies, you'll notice she's almost always photographed from the left side. This is my father on the set of Shogun, where he received an Emmy nomination. And I show these pictures because they all have stories relating to his survival skills. During the production filming, there was an earthquake scene, and the stuntman rigged a half-mile trench with explosives that was designed to go off and swallow the opposing army. When the cameras were rolling, the explosives didn't go off, and the stuntman climbed into the pit to check. And of course, they all went off and buried him with 20 feet of debris. Everybody panicked except for my father, who never panicked. He rigged up a lever arm with a piece of timber and a big boulder and was able to lift some of the debris off the stuntman and saved his life. And that was written up in the book, The Making of Shogun. He filmed First Blood with Sylvester Stallone, and there was a famous scene in the cave that was lit by just a candle. That had never been done before, and when Sylvester Stallone saw the footage, he came to my father and said, "But they can't see my face." And my father said, "Don't worry about it." But he pressed, he said, "But they can't see my face." And my father said, "Don't worry, everybody knows who you are." That scene became very famous and was copied by many cinematographers in subsequent movies. During his career, he worked with directors like Francis Ford Coppola and William Friedkin, and he was never fired once. And he knew how to defend himself in an industry where directors and producers always fire or look to fire anyone they can to cover up their own mistakes. I used to work as an errand boy with him in the summer on his productions. And one day a director came over yelling and screaming that a sound boom had ruined the footage. My father listened for a minute and then asked the director calmly, "Well, is this scene at the end of the movie?" And when the director said yes, he said, "Well, then it doesn't matter. By then, everybody in the theater will have either left or fallen asleep." No one ever, after dealing with the Nazis, he was never intimidated by anyone in Hollywood. So a big part of this story, as David told you at the beginning, was the fact that my father kept this a secret for 50 years. Why did he keep the secret? It's possible that he just couldn't go back and revisit the horrible times. It's possible he didn't want it to define our lives and make us feel like victims. And it's possible he wanted to protect us if it ever happened again. The other possible reason was that he thought it was too much for us to process, and might have been right. When my 12-year-old daughter, Andrea, read the book, she had a panic attack and had trouble breathing, and we had to take her to the hospital. This is the book that arrived at my door 50 years to the day later. My father had bound it on a publication press he built in his basement, and even did the gold inlay on the cover himself. I sat down and read it immediately. My first reaction was shock, because I had seen pictures of the Holocaust all my life, and like many, I dismissed them without enough thought. But now I knew that in some of the pictures, it could have been my father. After the shock wore off, I felt very foolish. I should have figured it out. There were many clues in hindsight, and he never talked about his family. As soon as I finished the book, I picked up the phone to call my father. I was in Montana and he was in New York, and it was the most difficult phone call I've ever made. My father was very worried and apprehensive that his oldest son would be mad and angry that he had kept such a big secret. After a short little small talk, I told my father that I loved him, and more important, that I was proud to be his son. And my father, who rarely showed emotion, I could tell even 2,000 miles away that 50 years of angst was rolling off his shoulders. As soon as the rest of the family read the book, we decided to make a quick trip to Hungary so that my father could show us everything he wrote about in his story. And we visited the home they grew up in, the apartment in the ghetto, where we found the secret room that he was building and never finished before he was taken away to the labor camp. We visited the train station, and we went to the synagogue that he had attended as a young boy. It so happened that this was Holocaust Remembrance Week, and as we walked into the synagogue that was in just shambles, we found out that the head of the synagogue would give a speech, which my father translated as he talked. And the head of the synagogue, who was in his 90s, said that I was once the leader of the second biggest synagogue in Hungary, but now I am still the president of the congregation, but I no longer have a congregation to preside over. After the talk, we put stones on the monuments that my father had placed for his parents. And as we walked out, I told my father, I'm so glad that Hungary is trying to make amends. He took me by the arm and took me around the corner and showed me something I hadn't noticed. There on a wall under some ivy was a fresh swastika that couldn't have been more than 2 weeks old. He told me that I must always be vigilant because evil and hatred would never go away. The last stop on the trip was the summer house, and in the chapel behind the house, behind the altar, I noticed the Star of David. This was the first time on my trip that I got a little emotional, because there was the first visual evidence that my father, who had told us he was Roman Catholic to protect us and watched his children raised as Episcopals, was actually a Jew. After he shared his story, he became famous as a Holocaust survivor, and his life changed. He was invited by the U.S. Holocaust Museum to the Capitol Rotunda, where he lit a candle with Senator Joe Lieberman in memory of all the Holocaust victims and survivors. One of the other honorees was Elie Wiesel. I was very proud of my father to be in the same photo with Elie Wiesel, and I was very proud that my father could smile. I was told that Elie Wiesel, until the very later part of his life, rarely smiled. The Hungarian government decided to give him a Lifetime Achievement Award. They had a film festival and they invited several Hungarian Americans to talk. Filmmakers like Vilmos Zsigmond and Maurice Jarre, who did the sound for Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago. They all gave very nice talks, thanking everybody, very reminiscent to an Oscars ceremony, until it was my father's turn. He was polite, but to the point. He reminded the Hungarians in the audience of what they had done to their own people and admonished them to never let it happen again. As he walked off the stage, he turned to our mother and said, "I don't think I'll ever be invited back." And he never was. Takeaways and wisdom. The Hungarian government sold out their war heroes. The Hungarian Nazi Party was more brutal to their own Jewish citizens than the Germans. They routinely would stop them on the street, and just for amusement, they would beat or torture them and sometimes kill them. And the worst was the Czechoslovakian Red Cross that stole money from the survivors. When my father left Theresienstadt on his way to Papa, he was told to stop in Prague and that he'd be given 10,000 koruna raised from around the world. When he got to the Red Cross office, the person behind the desk said they had given away all the money, but here, take 50 koruna from my own pocket to help you. And of course, that might have bought him a cup of coffee. He took the money, and then the man behind the desk asked him to sign a piece of paper. My father couldn't read Czechoslovakian, but he noticed at the bottom there was the symbol for 10,000 koruna and realized that he was being asked to sign a receipt and the people in the office were stealing the rest of the money. But he did get even. He broke into the office and broke into the safe and took all the money that was there, which he then took out into the street and distributed to the survivors who it had been raised for. So this is the favorite slide when I give this presentation, and after it's populated, I would invite anybody who wants to take a picture. This is advice that my grandparents gave to my father. And when I first started giving this talk, I did it in honor of my father. But as I did it more and more times, I realized that I needed to honor my grandparents too, for without their advice and support, my father wouldn't have survived. They told him that you are not defeated till you give up. They told him that bitterness and self-pity are the medicines of the weak. They told him you can't help others unless you keep yourself strong. And in the last letter from his mother that my father received when he was at the labor camp, she signed it, "Think of us often." When I did the research for this presentation, I found out that by the time he got and read the letter, his mother was already dead. I invite anybody who'd like to take a picture of this slide. But here is the copy of the actual letter that he received. And the signature is "Think of us often." All of my father's letters and photos are reproduced in his book, but the originals were all donated to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and they stand in the archives at the Smithsonian. The last piece of advice my grandfather gave my father was to shave every day. And although my father didn't understand the advice, he followed it faithfully. He shaved at the labor camp using the hot water from the train engines, and he shaved at Bergen-Belsen using cold water and a dull razor. When he shaved, he felt clean. One day at Belsen, when he was down to 90 pounds, he shaved and felt clean and strong. And all of a sudden, he had an epiphany. He knew he was going to survive, that no one could break his spirit. And there and then he understood his father's advice. Today, I understand that shaving every day was a metaphor. When you are persecuted or bullied, you need to do something to maintain your humanity. And if you do so, you can be beaten or killed, but you can never be defeated. I shave every day in memory of my father, even when I was in the backwoods of Alaska. In 2004, my father was diagnosed with cancer, and his doctor said the average man would have 4 to 6 months to live. I asked my father if he was scared, and when he said no, I asked him why. And he said because he never considered himself to be an average man. 7 years later, he died in 2011. And when he died, he still had a smile on his face. He had come to America, started a new family, had a successful career, and kept the Laszlo family name alive. And that was something that he felt would have made his father very proud. The life story, in my opinion, was a triumph of strong will over evil. And his survival gave me and my family the gift of life. This is a picture of the first get-together we had after my father did share the story at our house in Montana. And I want to thank very much Dave Preston and the sons and daughters of Greater Philadelphia, of Holocaust survivors of Greater Philadelphia, who have given me the privilege of sharing my story with you. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Andy. Can everyone hear me? I want to thank you so much for this very, very poignant and powerful presentation. I haven't had a chance to read the book in its entirety. I have read parts of it, some of which you certainly went over very expertly in your presentation today. I encourage everyone to buy the book. It's available on Amazon, which is where I got it. And there's a code on your screen here now that you can scan to order the book. Andy, it was really a privilege to host you today. We have a few questions, but before we get to the questions, and I myself have questions, after all, I'm a journalist, but I want to give my friend Eva Weissman an opportunity to speak, and you'll know why pretty quickly.
Well, I don't know if I could speak after that. So my family is from Papa, and my mom was in Auschwitz and my father in Bergen-Belsen, and I was born there. I didn't recognize the spots, the places on the pictures that you showed of Papa, but all the postcards and any picture that's taken of Papa shows the apartment where we lived. So we were on, I think, Kossuth. So that's it.
Well, so can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear
Yeah.
me.
Mhm.
Okay, so, that is so poignant to me that you were born in Belsen because of the passage that my father wrote that he shared his potato with a pregnant woman.
No, I was born in Papa.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I
I'm
was
sorry.
born. My parents met after the war.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. I misunderstood you. Sorry.
but both my both sets of grandparents and aunts and uncles, perished in the Holocaust.
You might recognize some names if you read the book, because I bet you our families knew each other.
Probably. And were you born here?
Yes, he arrived in 1947 and I was born in 1952 in New York.
Yeah. What's your
I'm sorry.
mother was Hungarian.
My mother was not. They met at a dinner party on Park Avenue. And my father married the daughter of the person who put the party on.
Well, so
Yeah.
that brings me to my question, one of my questions, and also Isabel has a question as well about your mother. Isabel wants to know if you think that your mother, well, did your mother know that your dad was a survivor? Did she tell us a little bit about your mom?
So she did not know. And whereas I was very quick to tell my father how I loved him and was proud of him and I wasn't mad, my mother was a little upset that for 50 years he kept this a secret from her. She found out about 6 months before we did because she proofread the manuscript for him that he wrote. And when I talked about I should have recognized clues, looking back, there were so many clues to Jewish heritage on both my father and my mother's side of the family. My mother's cousin was the national chairman of the League of Jewish Women. When I went to Exeter and looked in the yearbook, my grandfather was named David Goldberg, not David Granger. There were many clues, and probably the most obvious one was one day at a restaurant, my father ate everything on his plate but the beets. And when I asked him why, he said he was fed beets on Hitler's birthday. You wonder why a smart person doesn't put two and two together. Also, he was so excessively compulsively prepared. When he traveled, he had money sewn in his clothes. His toilet kit had water purification tablets and medicine and enough instruments to do surgery. When there were hurricanes coming to New York, he filled all the bathtubs with water and built a still in the basement. I mean, this was a man who was prepared for everything.
Andy, tell us a little bit about your mother. What's her background? What can you tell us?
Her grandfather, my great grandfather, came to this country as an indentured servant from Russia, we think. He didn't write his story down, so some of it I'm just going by hearsay. But he served out his 7-year indenture somewhere in Ohio and moved to Butte, Montana after his indenture to start his life. He worked 6 days a week to serve his indenture for 7 years. And the 7th day he worked to make money so he would have money when he was done with his indenture servitude. He started a business in Butte, became a successful businessman, and bought a ranch in Ennis, which we still have. His son were Jeffrey Granger and David Granger, and one of David Granger's son is on this call with us today. Jeffrey and David moved to New York to run a brokerage business. Jeffrey was the person who was who put on the dinner party, and my father showed up because his Uncle George was invited, who was a loud, boisterous artist who was able to kind of liven up some of the New York dinner parties. My mother family was very much of the Jewish legacy, but she didn't practice because starting with my great-grandfather, after he started and founded the first Jewish congregation in Butte, Montana, he converted to become an Episcopal because he was afraid of being Jewish in Butte and thought that would benefit their business. So even though we have Jewish roots on both sides of our family, my mother was brought up Episcopal.
Which probably served you well at Exeter.
Well, Exeter was very progressive. My grandfather was a student there when he was named David Goldberg in early 1900s, I think 1903. My great-grandfather, who like many immigrants believed in education, found out that one of the copper kings in Butte, which were the richest people in the world at that time, sent his child to Exeter. So we put my 13-year-old grandfather on a train, sent him to Exeter, and told him to register. His brother David, which is my cousin who's on the Squall father, also went to Exeter. And then my uncle, myself, my brother, my sister, my two daughters, and my nephew just graduated last year. So there are 9 members of our family. Exeter was always very progressive.
And yet your father said he was Roman Catholic, you said.
Well, he never went to church. He just said that so we wouldn't ask him questions that might lead to having to have the discussion of his past earlier than he wanted to. He never went to church.
But did your parents recognize that both of them had Jewish roots?
We didn't ever talk about it, and no one even recognized it. Well, I mean, it was obvious, but it didn't really come up until after he shared his secret, and I was 45 years old.
Fascinating. You're getting a lot of thanks in the chat. Probably more thanks than questions. But I would encourage anyone who has any questions to raise your hand or put your question in the chat. And I'd like to, well, go ahead, Marcy.
I was just going to say that
sorry, Eva. Yeah.
that, the secret and the silence is something that all of us have in our lives, which is just, you can't really explain that.
My comment there is some people didn't want to talk about it. Some people couldn't talk about it. And my father was of that ilk for a long time, but I think when he started contemplating death, he realized that he had an obligation to share his legacy with us for the next generations. And in a way, I think it was very therapeutic for him to, get that secret off his back.
I'm curious, Andy, as to how you've raised your children.
So I married a Catholic lady, and a religion was never a big part of our lives. I went with her sometimes to Catholic mass just because she was my wife and I wanted to support her. And we gave our children the option of going to church with us or not, and they opted not to. So I don't think they really have any strong affinity to any religion. It's something I don't talk with them much about, so I don't have a really good answer.
Okay. Isabel, do you have a question? I'm looking in the
My question is, I know many children of survivors who always wanted to know their parents' story. And were you ever angry after he told you that he held it back all these years, and you had so many questions probably?
I was never angry at him for that. I appreciated him telling me. I think I understood how traumatic it was for him to revisit that, because I read the book before I called him. No, I was never angry. I would say I was more proud. I think I have an understanding of how much will and strength you had to have to survive, when you were starving and freezing, and still to try to, protect his new family and not burden them with his with his suffering.
Thank you.
I'm reading some of the chat questions right now. Let's see.
It's mostly comments. Yeah.
Mostly comments, right?
Yeah.
Someone asked if the surname Laszlo was Hungarianized from another name. Laszlo is probably the most common name in Hungary.
Right.
My grandfather's name was Laszlo. My father was Laszlo Andras. The Andras was Americanized to Andrew, and I'm Andrew Laszlo Jr. I forgot to say one thing that really I should have when I told how my grandfather was taken away to die. So many of us have friends or parents or grandparents with cancer who lived just long enough to see their children graduate from school. And I think the reason my grandfather died just a couple days after he saw my father is he was really in terrible shape and was going to die anyway. But when he saw that his one child had survived, I think he was ready to die in peace.
Anyone else have a question?
How has this affected your children?
So, my oldest child was 15 when my father shared the secret, and she tried to read the book and couldn't. My wife tried to read it and couldn't. It was just too hard on her. So they haven't read it. My youngest read it, and as I mentioned, we had to take her to the emergency room because she had a panic attack. I don't think it's affected them very much, but it's something they just don't like to talk about.
Well, it has affected us very much. Esther Dukes has a question. Yes, Esther. I'll unmute you. Okay. Esther, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Unmute. Okay. Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for speaking. I have one or two questions. For Andrew, did your father, after he told his story, did he go back at all to being Jewish openly, like go to synagogue or hang out with other Jews? Because we had friends where they told their children they were Protestant. And I don't think it was so much they didn't want to talk about the past, but they were afraid that there would be another situation like with the Nazis, which is actually conceivable right now. And they didn't want their children in danger. I was wondering if your father went back at all to Judaism. after
So
he
I
revealed
think
his background.
I think he felt very strongly that he didn't want us to, he wanted to protect us and in case it ever did happen again, because I think he
Yeah.
felt very strongly that it could. But even after he shared the story, I don't think he was ever really interested in organized religion. I think to some extent, organized religion reminded him of even though it wasn't anybody's fault, of losing his mother and father and all the things he suffered. So he never did. He never was active in any church or synagogue, other than the later part of his life, he did accompany our mother to church once or twice just to support her.
I see our friends where I mentioned it, I knew about it, but I was about the same age as their son. So I knew they were really Jewish, but he didn't, because my parents said, don't say anything to him. But when the mother was dying on her deathbed, she told her son that they were really Jewish. But just as this is a very tiny little thing, but the coach your father was close to, it's Lajos in Hungarian, Lajos.
Oh, is that how you pronounce it? Could you say that again, please?
J is pronounced like Y in Hungarian, and S is pronounced like SH. So Lajos.
Lajos, is that right?
Lajos.
Lajos.
Yes, and your uncle was Sándor. Sándor is the same as Alexander in Hungarian.
So my brother is named Jeffrey Alexander Laszlo. And I have another brother, James George Laszlo, named for the uncle that took him in when he came to America. And my sister is named Elizabeth Ann Laszlo. His mother's name was Lisbeth, and Ann was our mother's name.
Also, what's interesting is you're a junior, and Jews don't have juniors because they name their children after someone who's deceased. So it's interesting.
You know, I've been told that, and I was aware of that. I'm not sure why he did name me Junior, but I was their firstborn.
It's nice. Thank you. It was fascinating. Your father was just absolutely amazing.
He never gave up his humanity. He was always kind, and he always supported people that needed help. He stood up for his crew in the movie business. He always shared what he had. And like everybody who had a father like that, I didn't appreciate him enough when he was alive, but I'm sure that's not all that uncommon. And that's one of the reasons I'm devoted myself in my retirement to honor him and his memory.
It's really, really beautiful. One last question. Speaking of movies, do you think this might become a movie?
So I have been in contact with Barbra Streisand and Steven Spielberg, or tried to. I haven't really got to speak to them as much as their people, because I would love to get their attention, whether it would be to make a movie or to have them help me share the story, because it's my passion to share the story. It's one small thing I can do maybe to prevent it from happening again. I just did hear from Barbra Streisand's people again last week, but as much as she was a great friend of my father, and as much as my father worked with Steven Spielberg, I've had a very tough time approaching them. You know, they're getting old and they have a very strong insulation of people that keep people like myself from corresponding or communicating with them. I don't know. I would be very interested in having a movie just because it would share a story, but right now I haven't found anyone who's interested.
Well, as the book becomes more popular, as I know it will, and I know that it will be very widely read, and the story gets out there, we know that you will have success with that, and with that maybe will come some other projects down the road. On behalf of my organization, Sons and Daughters of Holocaust Survivors of Greater Philadelphia, I want to thank you, Andy, for presenting your story to us today. I want to thank all the people around the world who joined us, and to recommend that they get your book, get their hands on this very worthy memoir, extraordinary and unusual as it is. And we wish you much success going forward in telling your story. You are one of our brothers. So
Well, thank you, David. And I want to say it was my pleasure to talk to your group. And if there's ever anything I can do to help you share this story, which is, not the horrors of the Holocaust, it's a celebration of life and renewal. If there's ever anything I can do for your group, you know how to get a hold of me.
Thank you. And someone just put in the chat, they would like to know how to get a hold of you. So can you just spell out your email address for everybody?
The email address is footnote2history@gmail. So just one word, footnote2history@gmail.com. And all of my contact information and all my stories are posted on my Facebook page, which is also Footnote to History.
Fabulous. Thanks, everybody. The recording of this program will appear on my YouTube channel within the next 24 hours or so. And I just want to remind everybody that our next free Zoom program will be at 7 p.m. March 3rd. Randy Biederman will speak about her 2019 book that she co-authored with her late husband, Mark Biederman. And the title is Schindler's Listed, The Search for My Father's Lost Gold. That's 7 p.m. Sunday, March 3rd. The Zoom link will be the same one you're using right now. I hope you'll be able to join us. Thanks again, Andy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David. Bye-bye.